This is American Government Friday, October 23rd, 2020. Um, Following up from the last lecture, which introduced the historical, I should say, the original intentions for the presidency and the creation of the presidency, the Constitutional Convention and its explanation by Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 70 through 74. Today we're going to look at the major historical changes in the presidency. And I also want to make a few comments about Chapter 10 of the Wilson book, that you should pay special attention to. And also note, by the way, that I've divided this subject of the historical growth of the presidency, and as you're going to see in my notes, that's the single word that captures the historical development of the presidency from the founding is growth. I'll explain what I mean by that in a few minutes. But I've divided it into today and the next lecture, which will take some of the discussion of the development of the presidency in Chapter 10 of the Wilson text and connect it with a couple of readings for Monday, including U.S. v. Curtis Wright, a very important court case from the 1930s, which you'll read for Monday, and also a great campaign speech on the presidency by Kennedy in the Nichols Reader, which will develop some aspects, especially in Chapter 10's discussion of the growth of the power and influence of the presidency and what's responsible for the expansion of the presidential power. I'm going to divide that issue between today and Monday and focus more on certain external factors and other issues that have caused the presidential office and the scope of the presidency and power of the presidency to grow in the last 2.5 centuries. So you should have the notes that I sent out for today, plus this chartograph of the executive branch you should have in front of you. And this is based on Wilson Chapter 10 and Chapter 11, by the way. So the material in Chapter 10 and Chapter 11, which is on the bureaucracy, the administrative branch of the executive branch, that's Chapter 11. We'll turn to that on Wednesday. This chartograph or diagram of the executive branch, which I'm going to use to guide our discussion of the institutional growth of the presidency, is what you should have in front of you, today's notes and that chartograph. So Chapter 10 starts out with a nice discussion of the comparison between the presidential system and the parliamentary system. This first part of Chapter 10 is like the first part of Chapter 9. I love being brilliant, where Wilson et al., et alia, and the other authors of this text compare the constitutional system of the United States in Chapter 9 with Congress and in Chapter 10 with the presidency with the other major alternative with respect to popular or constitutional government, or at least popular government in the modern age, and that's the parliamentary system. There in Chapter 9, which compared a Congress and a parliament, and here in Chapter 10, which compares a presidential system in the parliament. As you'll see, the major thing that divides our system and those systems is, of course, the separation of powers. Our political tradition, again, through the Federalist and the great authors in modern political philosophy and theory that informed the founding, because here's just a little timeline. Modern political philosophy really began to develop in the 15 and 1600s, and especially took its decisive form that created the rhetoric and institutions of modern political life in Thomas Hobbes's great work of political philosophy, published in 1651, The Leviathan. Hobbes, again, as you remember from the material on the Declaration of Independence, was the great political philosopher who formed the concept of natural rights, on which all modern politics is based. And his successor, so Hobbes wrote in 1651, and very quickly his infamous book, it was burned in London, and Hobbes had to flee to Paris to save his life because he was branded an atheist, although he eventually managed to come back to his country, England, after the restoration of the monarchy in 1656, and lived to be a very old man, I think to 91 or 94. I'm only 2 years away from that myself. And then his great successor in English political philosophy was John Locke. And it's John Locke who actually transformed the Hobbesian modern political tradition into into the tradition that Americans are familiar with, because it's Locke, for instance, who reformulated Hobbes's theory of sovereignty based on constitutional limitations and the primacy of a written constitution and the separation of powers. John Locke, in his great work, The Second Treatise of Government, published in 1688, about 30 years after Hobbes published, um, was the great author of modern constitutionalism. Also, Locke focused on turning natural rights, the right of life, into the right of liberty and property. And so life, liberty, and property, that great triad of rights that's embodied in the Fifth Amendment of the American and the 14th Amendment of the American Constitution, really owes John Locke. So just remember what's going on at the same time that these great works of modern theory are being published, modern political philosophy. In 1620, the Plymouth colony was formed. Just at the time, by the way, of the Great English Civil War, in which led to the deposing and eventually beheading of King Charles I. In 1641, he was deposed, and in 1649 was beheaded. The Great Civil War between the Puritans and the Anglican Church, and between the Royalists and the supporters of Parliament, which again led to that Civil War. Well, that Civil War was over in 1656 when the monarchy was restored and the Anglican Church in some ways triumphed. But the American colonies had been founded, and so in some ways you have to remember that as the tradition of modern political philosophy unfolded, the American colonial experiment was unfolding. And then the second greatest modification of the traditional modern philosophy that had an effect on our framers was its transformation by the great French author Montesquieu, who in 1733 wrote his great work, The Spirit of Laws, in which he took the Lockean doctrine of the separation of powers and checks and balances and formulated it into the three powers that we recognize as legislative, executive, and judicial. So just look at the timeline. Hobbes published in 1651. Locke transformed his teaching into the constitutionalism that we recognize in 1688. Montesquieu in France reformulated it and translated it into the actual tradition that Madison quotes from in Federalist 49 through 51. And so remember, our country was founded in 1776. And then the Constitutional Convention was in 1787. So when all of the young men and political leaders who led the American Revolution and the constitutional founding, when they were in school and college, the books that they were reading were these great works of political philosophy. So to some degree, our constitutional system follows the Lockean and the Montesquieuian understanding of constitutional separation of powers. And that, if you remember, and this is what the preface on Wednesday's lecture was, that led directly to the expansion and creation of the vigorous and energetic executive. And in some ways, that was the creation, that was the addition, the creative addition of our founders, who took the Lockean Montesquieuian separation of powers, built the Constitution upon that theory, and within that theory saw the necessity to, not just because of the practical limitations of the Articles of Confederation, but actually built the strong executive, the energetic executive that we discussed on Wednesday, into the American presidency. So what Wilson does in chapter 10 is compare the other modern experiment with popular government, which is the parliamentary system. Now, the core of the parliamentary system is not to separate the policy-making branches of government into a separate legislative branch and a separate executive branch, but the parliamentary system, based on the emergence of this form of government in the English parliamentary system, but also on the continent, is a system in which the legislative and executive powers are not separated. They are constitutionally joined. And Wilson does a good job at the beginning of chapter 9 of explaining the difference between a Congress and a parliament, our Congress and a parliament, and in chapter 10 between the president and a prime minister. So look at that section. It has many important points of comparison. For instance, it's not just that they're separate branches. The framers also understood, and this goes back to our discussion of the Electoral College, is that the president had to have a different electoral base from the Congress. And so that's how our political system has grown and developed around that separation. Not only the institutional separation between the executive and the legislature, but the electoral separation between the election of the president, which, as we saw in the last couple of weeks, has become a popular election through the Electoral College, to be sure. But uh, but but because the president and the Congress are not only institutionally separated with different powers and responsibilities, and as Wilson points out, whereas in a parliamentary system, the prime minister who comes out of the parliament, who is elected to parliament, and then whose majority party becomes the majority party in the parliament, then becomes the prime minister, the head of the executive branch, and chooses his ministers or her ministers from among the parliament. So, but that's because those systems both join those institutions together so that the leader of the executive branch, the prime minister in a parliamentary system, is also the leader of the legislative branch, the parliament, or the etc. But also electorally and politically, they are joined. In most parliamentary systems, the primary election that citizens vote for is the elections for parliament, and then out of those, the result of those parliamentary elections, and that's why in the party system that we discussed, the multi-party system that we discussed the last week or so, the prime minister assembles his or her coalition out of the majority party or coalition of parties, and that forms the ability to run the government. Well, again, in our system, constitutionally they are separated, electorally they are separated, and therefore the fact of the development of the presidency in our system is the president and presidential election in some ways applies to a different constituency than the Congress does. So all the advantages and disadvantages of separating the legislative and executive branch in our system are developed to their full in this chapter, because in some ways, the great advantage of the parliamentary system is that it's much more responsive to shifts in public opinion. If the majority party in a parliamentary system loses the majority on a vote, for instance, like in England or most other parliamentary systems, then the executive branch falls and you have to have new elections. So, on one level, because of our set electoral terms, 2 years for the House, 6 years for the Senate, 4 years for the president, um, we really do force citizens to think differently about the president's program and the congressional program. And you can see that in our politics today pretty dramatically. So there are advantages and disadvantages to every system of government. One advantage of the parliamentary system, as I just mentioned, was a certain responsiveness to public opinion. Because if there's a major shift in public opinion and policy, it's reflective in parliamentary elections and and in the prime minister's political base. The other advantage you could say is because the executive and legislative branches are joined, and the head of the executive branch is also the head of the legislative branch, it's easier to get major changes in policy through. And so those might be considered advantages. On the other hand, you could say that the great advantages of our constitutional system is there's a certain distance from public opinion. And for a major shift in public opinion to really change governmental policy, it has to affect two separate branches of government. And there's a very fine discussion in the Wilson text about um, unified versus divided government and gridlock. Because with a separated system of constitutional powers like legislative and executive branches, the vesting clauses, as we saw in our consideration of the Constitution, and because of the necessity of a separate political branch cooperating with another political branch, the theme of our politics is this question of unified or divided government with respect to party. And Wilson does a very good job of showing that just as often as the president's party is the same as the congressional party, just as often they're different. And very interesting consideration of whether that's a good or a bad thing. And as you'll see, that section that compares those times when the president has the same party as the Congress, as opposed to a different party, sometimes in terms of policy making, the period of divided government is just as creative and fruitful as the period of unified government. Now that's because, as we'll see, as we have seen, that's because of the nature of our two-party system. Our two parties, remember, and this goes back to the Banfield piece and the Caesar piece, our two parties are broad coalitions of different ideas. And even though in the last generation our two parties have become more polarized ideologically, Republicans are more conservative, Democrats are more progressive or liberal, nevertheless, as Wilson points out, within each party there's often some remarkably different spread of ideas. which you can actually see in our presidential politics today, and for that matter, in the politics under President Obama. So, and every other Democratic and Republican president. So, in some ways, this will point forward to our next lecture when Kennedy discusses the kinds of leadership in the modern presidency. And he has a very interesting discussion, as you'll see for Monday, about how the president operates as party leader. Well, again, we'll see that it's because of the unique nature of our two parties, broad and encompassing different ideologies at times, although there's still a fundamental unity. And I do think that voting for either one of the two parties does initiate major changes in American government, as we've seen and probably will see in the foreseeable future. So uh, uh, that discussion of unified and divided government dovetails nicely with Wilson's discussion of the differences between the presidential and the parliamentary system. Now, to stand back and raise the question of which is better off, and note, by the way, as Wilson points out in chapter 10, um, at least most of the systems in Europe and other places out the world that have popular forms of government, it's a mixed system. France, for instance, has both a separately elected president and a prime minister. Israel also has a president and a prime minister. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that the European systems of government, and in some ways, the systems in Latin America and throughout the world that were colonized by European powers, followed the parliamentary model. But you have to remember that up till World War I, almost all the countries in Europe were constitutional monarchies, where you had a hereditary and royal family, an aristocratic class that actually dominated the country up until World War I, when both in Germany and France and in England, where a lot of the aristocracy was actually killed off in the war. But then don't forget, in Germany, there was a revolution at the end of World War I where the Tsar, the Kaiser was deposed. There was a revolution in Russia where the Tsar was deposed. So, in some ways, part of the development in European politics and in global politics that imitated them was the dismantling of constitutional monarchies and the replacement with parliamentary systems. Well, one problem is since parliamentary systems shift the executive branch so easily from shifts in public opinion, the reason that many European systems created mixed systems where you had something like a separate president was to compensate for that lack of focus and stability that a hereditary monarchy created. So the reason that so many systems, and by the way, don't forget, 9 countries in Europe like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Belgium still have constitutional monarchies. Britain still has a queen, and interestingly enough, by the way, the queen is probably the most powerful constitutional monarch in all of existing governments. Um, Japan still has a constitutional monarchy. So, but no other constitutional monarchy in Europe or throughout the world has the kind of power that Queen Elizabeth has. Having said that, though, the point I'm making and that Wilson makes is the reason there's so many mixed systems like France, etc., is because when they moved from a constitutional monarchy to a parliamentary system of government, they felt the need to have some kind of stable national figurehead at the head of politics. Well, our presidential system combines that separately elected and separate presidency, but the difference between our system, the presidential system, and the presidential mixed systems or constitutional monarchies around the world is that our president is actually also the focus of political debate and change. So, so our presidential system creates a separate presidency, which is both in some ways ceremonial, as you'll see in Kennedy's discussion of the nature of presidential leadership in the modern world for Monday. And but then is not only ceremonial. The president has important ceremonial powers as head of state, but the president's also the focus of political debate and leadership, as we've seen in this season's presidential election. So um, um, those parts of chapter 10 are well written and worth your attention, and we'll come back to some of those aspects on Monday too. Um, um, what I want to do as a preface to discussing the historical growth of the presidency, which we'll get to in a minute, is Wilson's interesting discussion of um, the constitutional powers of the president. Now, that section of chapter 10 looks back to our consideration of the Constitution. So, as I suggested in the notes, you might want to go back and look at your PRQs and our class notes and discussion of the Constitution, especially with respect to Article 2 in the executive branch. But I want to pick up with the last major question that I left with on our last lecture, which is once everyone at the Constitutional Convention, insofar as they remained for all 4 months and signed the final Constitution, um, saw the necessity of a strong, energetic executive. But there was a difference of opinion at the founding and between, for instance, the two giants of constitutional thinking, um, Madison and Hamilton, as to where the political leadership of our system would reside. As we saw when we looked at Federals 70 through 74 and Hamilton's treatment of the presidency, it shouldn't surprise you that Hamilton's view of the presidency is that this is a presidency-centered system. Madison also who don't forget was the great architect of separation of powers and checks and balances in Federalist 51. Madison also wanted a strong president, but Madison wanted a passive president. Madison, who eventually joined the same party as Jefferson, the Republicans, and remember when we saw the development of the party system, part of that had to do with the fact that they thought that the presidential power, the expansive presidential power that Hamilton advocated, and in some ways that George Washington embodied, was a threat to Republican government, which is why they called their party the Republican Party. Although, ironically, as historians know, Jefferson turned out to be one of the most expansive presidents. So, for instance, just to give you a quick example, one of the major additions to our territory was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which Jefferson purchased from Napoleon Bonaparte for about $15 million, I think, the price at that time, which was pretty cheap real estate for all the real estate that we got, since the Louisiana Purchase took the boundary of the United States from the Mississippi to the Missouri River and up through the Northwest. Probably added a third of our existing territory to our territory at that time. Jefferson thought that he didn't have the power to do it. He was a Republican and thought the presidency should be limited, but that's not how he behaved. And as we'll see when we see the major historical development, I'm going to argue this today and Monday, is that the historical presidency is essentially the Hamiltonian presidency. Now, that has a bearing on Wilson's discussion of constitutional powers in chapter 10, because it's interesting. Wilson gives an account of the actual powers granted to the president in Article 2 is somewhat skimpy. To quote from Wilson on page 201, taken alone, this list of powers is not very impressive. Well, part of that's probably true to some degree, and the suggestion is the powers that you see listed in Article 2 doesn't describe the presidency as we know it, and there's some truth to that, although we'll come back to that when we read the Burns article for next week. But what I wanted to do was to connect that discussion of the relatively limited list of powers in Article 2 with the controversy over the vesting clauses in Article 1 and 2 that we discussed when we looked at the Constitution, and I'll remind you of that discussion in a minute, and to connect that with the growth of the presidency into the institution that we have today. So, if you remember, the vesting clause of Article 1 starts out this way. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress. And Article 2, as you remember, has just the general statement, the executive power shall be vested in the president. Part of the controversy in constitutional interpretation, which divided Madison and Hamilton, was how to read this list of powers. As I suggested, since the vesting clause in Article 2 is somewhat general and doesn't refer to herein granted the listed powers, the implication, certainly that Hamilton developed, and that in some ways the historical presidency has followed, is that the president's powers are based upon but not confined to that skimpy list of powers. And so in some ways, that great division of opinion between Madison and Hamilton, because here's how they read those powers. Hamilton thought that because of the general nature of the vesting clause, that the specific powers that were listed in Article 2 were not an exhaustive listing of the president's constitutional authority, and that the president had a broader residuum or flexible grant of authority under the vesting clause. Madison, on the other hand, tended to argue that the specific listing of powers in Article 2 was an enumeration and had the same relationship to the vesting clause that the listing of Congress's powers in Article 1, Section 8 had to the vesting clause in Article 1. let me summarize. So Madison had a tendency to have a much more limited view of presidential power, and had a tendency to argue that the structure of Article 1 and Article 2 were parallel. Both were enumerations of listed powers, and that the Congress's powers were limited to those 18 powers listed in Article 1, Section 8, and that the president's powers were listed to those somewhat skimpy powers in Article 1, Sections 2, Article 2, Sections 2 and 3. Again, what I'm going to try to argue is that it's ultimately the United States, as our country developed and as our institutions developed, essentially adopted the Hamiltonian view of the vesting clause, the nature of the powers in Article 2, because in some ways, the point I'm going to make today and Monday is that, especially in foreign affairs, by the way, we have the Hamiltonian president. Now, maybe that's a good or bad thing. When we turn to the criticisms of the contemporary presidency, we'll see. There are those who argue that the contemporary presidency has escaped its constitutional foundations. I'll come back to this, but for instance, in 1974, an important scholar of the presidency and of American government, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., published a book called The Imperial Presidency, in which he argued that the modern presidency, as described by Wilson in Chapter 10, and as we'll see on Monday, has transcended the constitutional limitations, and in some ways has become a more powerful institution than the framers intended. Well, as in many other things, it depends on which framer you turn to as an authority. And again, let's just say I've been studying this stuff all my life, and my particular scholarship was on the presidency, and I find it fascinating that these two giants of intellect, Madison and Hamilton, who cooperated in getting the Constitutional Convention going, who cooperated in constructing the institutions of the Constitution, and who cooperated in explaining those institutions in the Federalist Papers, almost immediately came to important differences of opinion as to how to interpret the very document and system that they had initiated, especially when it came to the powers of the presidency. So, with that in mind, again, and we'll come back to some of these issues on Monday. Let me describe the development of the historical presidency. And if you're looking at the notes, they're pretty short. The key word here is growth. That is to say, the main difference between the presidency and the executive branch as we see it today, and what the framers designed, was growth. There are three kinds of growth that I want to discuss, and two of them we'll primarily discuss today, and the third one will bleed over from today into Monday, and that is the size, scope, and power. So one giant big difference between the presidency and the executive branch as the framers designed it and as it exists today is the growth of the executive institutions in the executive branch. So here, you should look at my chartograph. I made that word up. On the executive branch and Wilson's description of these things. So if you note, if you're looking at the chartograph, again, that's this diagram right there. I'm going to presume you have it in front of you. You'll see that the executive branch today is a giant pyramid. The executive branch in 1789 consisted of the president, a vice president, 5 secretaries of executive departments, and about 800 Continental soldiers left over from the Articles of Confederation. Well, obviously, and you'll see that these three kinds of growth, institutional size and complexity, scope and function, and power, are all related to each other. As you're going to see, here's a kind of a simplistic statement, but true. The reason the presidency grew is because the nation grew, the power of the nation and its role in foreign affairs grew. We became, after all, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we became the most powerful history in the world today and in history. I mean, the American power in the 20th century and the 21st century, even though clearly there are other rivals in the world, outstrip the amount of power that any other historical civilization had. Rome at its height, China at its height, India at its height, the Aztec and Mayan empires at their height, all massive imperial systems. their power over both their own citizens to some degree, their own subjects, I should say, and the global situation around them pales in comparison to the power and influence of the United States, partially because our global military power is also a projection of our economic power. After World War II, with the destruction of much of the European economy and the Japanese economy, uh, uh, to some degree, uh, the United States became a military and foreign affairs superpower because it became the world's largest and most complex and powerful economy. And still, we're the largest economy in the world. We're larger. Now, this has changed in the last 10 to 20 years and may change in the next 20 years. But the United States economy is larger than uh, uh, Japan used to have the second largest economy, with the European Union third. Now, China has moved up in the last 10 to 20 years, and China is now the second largest economy in the world, with Japan and the European Union competing sort of for third and fourth place. But we're still the largest and most complex and powerful economy in the world. And that is, in some ways, the reason why we're also the world's superpower militarily and diplomatically. And as you'll see, those developments, those larger developments, had a profound influence on the nature of the presidency. But let's concentrate, at least at first, right now, on the growth of the institutional, the size and complexity of the executive branch itself. At the top, if you're looking at that little circle with a P in it, that's of course the president. The president is still the focus and head of the executive branch. Um, Article 2, Section 1 says the executive power shall be vested in the president. And the president has the responsibility and power to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He's given the power in Article 2, Section 2 to require the opinions in writing of his subordinates. And so the easy common sense way of saying that is the president is still the boss of the executive branch. That was made dramatically clear in the 1980s when President Reagan fired every air traffic controller that went on strike when the air traffic controllers went on strike. Now, they didn't anticipate that the computer system for the FAA had just been put in place, so President Reagan was able to fire all of them, but the reason he fired them was uh, it's explicit in the contracts of federal aviation regulators that they will not strike. Well, they went on strike, so they violated their contract. So he fired them all, several thousand, like 20,000 air traffic controllers. So the president still is the boss of the executive branch. Now, if you're looking at the pyramidal diagram, um, right underneath and around that P are two acronyms, the WHO and the EOP. Those were additions to the presidency during the New Deal and the Rooseveltian FDR's president, and especially in World War II and post-war American politics. Those two institutional additions were added because the the scope and task of the presidency had expanded. So the White House office is actually the personal extension of the presidency. That includes the chief of staff, and the White House office essentially structures and determines access to the presidency. It's like the personal office staff of a CEO. And so it turns out the chief of staff that the president selects without the advice and consent of Congress is one of the most powerful offices in the executive branch, because that often has the direct supervisory functions in terms of the immediate environment of the White House, and determines all kinds of things like the presidential schedule, access to the presidents, etc. That's the White House office. So consider that like the personal extension office of the president. The executive office of the presidency includes several other agencies that, especially since the New Deal and World War II and the rise of the military-industrial state and the intelligence state, um, especially with the CIA and the NSA, the National Security Agency, and the defense, all the different intelligence and spying agencies of the United States. It was felt that the president needed additional managerial tools to help run the executive branch and the burgeoning military industrial intelligence establishment. So within the executive office of the presidency are several important other agencies. and this is going to sound like alphabet soup, like, for instance, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. A little bit of historical background. There's no requirement, as we're going to see when we turn to domestic policymaking and the budgetary process of the United States. The Constitution has no requirement of a budget, either an executive budget, although it does say in Article 1, Section 9 that nothing can be spent from the Treasury except through an appropriation of law, and Congress sets the budget. But even Congress didn't develop a formal budget in some ways until the 20th century because of the growth of government and complexity and that kind of stuff. So in 1921, Congress created the Bureau of the Budget to help the president develop a federal budget and to supervise the spending of the growing executive agencies. In the 1970s, under President Nixon, the Bureau of the Budget, the BOB, was changed into the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and its tasks are essentially twofold. It's an administrative addition to the president that helps the president supervise and manage the 15 different executive departments and other agencies. So that's the management part. And budget, the Office of Management and Budget actually draws up, it records and supervises all spending of all executive branch agencies, and then draws up a comprehensive budget and prepares that for the president to submit to Congress the presidential budget. So the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, does exactly what it says it does. It helps the president draw up a budget, present it to Congress. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks, and how unsuccessful that process has been, but also helps the president manage. The National Security Agency, the NSA, was created after World War II to help the president manage both military, diplomatic, and intelligence agencies. And the National Security Advisor is an important, the head of the NSA. And the NSA brings together like the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the head of the CIA and everything. And so that the NSA is an important council that helps the president supervise and formulate intelligence policy, military policy, etc. And there are a few other agencies in the executive office of the presidency that help the president in his managerial or her managerial functions. So those are the two major institutional additions that surround the office of the president itself, and help the president in terms of the structuring the president's schedule and time, as I already mentioned, and in terms of certain managerial and budgetary functions of the executive branch and the military and industrial establishment. Now, the rest of the executive branch formally consists of the employees of the executive branch. Now, when we turn to Chapter 11 and discuss the rise of the civil service system, that's where if you're looking at the pyramid, most of the executive branch is in the civil service. And we'll discuss that when we turn to the bureaucracy next week. Now, and as you're going to see, there was a time, because it simply says in Article 2, Section 2, the president shall appoint, bind with the advised and consented, superior offices in the executive branch and the judges of the judiciary. There was a time prior to civil service reform, and we'll discuss this again next week when we talk about the bureaucracy, when the president appointed and fired with each new presidential election and change of party all the members of the executive branch. That was called the spoils system, the patronage system, where you would get a job in the executive branch because of your service to the party as a reward for supporting the party during the elections. And for reasons we'll discuss next week, that became unwieldy. When the size of the executive branch after the Civil War, because of military and other administrative purposes, and it was the Civil War that was actually the great turning point in the growth of American government in the executive branch. When you got to have the executive branch numbering over 100,000 individuals, you couldn't simply get rid of the executive branch and reappoint them and so the civil service system was designed in order to separate the administrative functions of government from the electoral changes, from shifting party affiliation and the different winners and losers of the presidential and congressional elections. Now, so most of the 2.5 million members of the executive branch, including the armed services, and of course the executive branch is now the largest unit of the federal government. most of them are beyond the president's appointment power and removal power. Again, you're going to see that what the civil service was an attempt to create a non-political kind of branch of the administration, and that's where most of the members of the executive branch are in. But between the presidency and the administrative layers that we just talked about, the WHO and the EOP, are the political appointees. And those number today, it's just a tiny top, about 3% of the federal pyramid, maybe about 3,000 appointments, including the 15 heads of the departments, the secretaries, and the undersecretaries. Those, the president still appoints, buying with the advice and consent of Congress, and those change with every presidential election, especially change of party. Um, Wilson in chapter 10 has a very good discussion in the last part of the chapter on presidential transition. And one of the reasons that presidential transition is such a big thing is the incoming president has to appoint the political heads of the executive branch. And so that part of the executive branch, where it says political appointees, those are still appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate, requiring just a majority vote of the Senate. And so that part of the executive branch does shift and change politically with American elections. So we'll discuss again more of this when we talk about the different parts of the bureaucracy in chapter 11. Now, another interesting part of our constitutional system is the rise of the IRAs, the independent regulatory agencies, at the end of the 1900s and the 1800s, the beginning of the 20th century, where the complexity of administration began to grow. That we created these agencies that are technically part of, but not part of, the executive branch. The president appoints them, but doesn't simply have the power to fire them. And there are all kinds of important regulatory agencies in there, like the FCC, the Federal Commerce Commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission. I'm sorry, the FCC is the Federal Communications Commission that regulate things like the internet, television, media, radio. Again, those are appointed by the president, but they tend to serve 7-year terms, and there's a certain amount of political independence in them. So um, we will come back to the other parts of the executive branch when we discuss chapter 11 next week. But the point is, in this chartograph, you see the massive growth, the institutional growth of the executive branch. Now, the primary reason that the executive branch grew to the point that it's now the foundation of the federal government is, in some ways, for the same reason that congressional staff and also grew, because the functions of government. So if you're looking at the notes, the second reason for the second kind of growth of the presidency is the scope and function. And that's because, beginning with the turn of the century, with the rise of federal regulation of the complex growing national economy and corporate capitalism, and also especially the New Deal, where one of the major functions added to the role of the federal government in our life was to manage and run the economy. Now, how well it does that and how it does that is a complex question, but the point is, it also expanded the scope and function of the presidency, insofar as we now expect the modern president to manage the economy. And it's a good debate within institutional commentary on the presidency how much the president can actually do that. We'll see that when we turn to the Toulis and Caesar article about the rise of the rhetorical presidency, one problem with the modern presidency is the American people may have projected expectations of managerial power and competence on an institution that really doesn't quite manage the economy. We'll talk more about that when we talk about domestic policy making, but nevertheless, there's no question that the and not just, by the way, with the rise of economic regulation of the economy, but also the rise of the welfare state, where the expanded role of the federal government is to provide direct assistance to millions of Americans, first through Social Security, and then in the 1960s with the Great Society programs, with Medicare, Medicaid, etc. Now you could say that the United States government has become not necessarily the manager of the US complex, giant, capitalistic free market of the United States, but at least has become a major economic player, setting things like interest rates that determine how much return you get on bank accounts, how much banks can charge for loans. So there are all kinds of powers and functions of the national government over the economy that make it one of the major players, if not the direct supervisor of the economy. Now, the point about the presidency is right or wrong, we now expect the president to actually manage the economy. And we place blame and praise on the economy on the president. That's part of the great controversy in the presidential election today. The U.S. before the pandemic, the U.S. economy was doing pretty well. How much of that was responsible? Was President Obama responsible? And how much was President Trump responsible? That's part of the partisan discussion in our politics today. But the bottom line is we blame and praise the president for economic performance of the U.S. economy. Now, the point I'm making is the president does have significant powers over the economy. We saw that when President Trump laid tariffs because of the legislative authority that gave him the power to do that. So, to some degree, we expect the president to be a major economic actor, and we've also added to the powers and authorities of the president to do that. Whether or not the presidency can actually do what we expect it to do is one of the great questions of the modern presidency. So, because of the expansion of the American economy and the expansion of federal regulation of the economy, the presidency also grew in scope and function. Now, the last kind of growth that I want to talk about is we'll just begin this discussion and continue it. Is the and Wilson talks about this in terms of the power of the president to persuade. Our presidency today, in some ways, is far more powerful than even Hamilton could have anticipated. And the president has political authority, and the presidential election has remarkable weight, as we've seen in the last couple of months, and we'll see over the next month and into the beginning of 2021. The presidential election is the primary political event of the nation, and the presidency is the figure around which almost all American politics eventually revolves. I think Hamilton understood that and probably foresaw part of it, but not to the extent to which the presidency has become a popular leader, as you'll see in Kennedy's discussion on Monday of presidential leadership. And there are several reasons for that, which we can begin discussing now and we'll continue with Monday. One reason, completely unanticipated by the framers and anyone else, was the rise of the mass media, the electronic media, starting with the radio in the 1920s, where Calvin Coolidge was the first president to address the entire nation live through radio, and through ultimately the growth of television and even the internet and social media. In other words, our media developed completely in a technological way unanticipated by anybody at the time of the founding. And of all the institutions of government that have benefited from that change in media, it's the presidency. Because as we saw with Congress, Congress is bicameral, first of all, and Congress looks like an organized food fight or a disorganized food fight at times. So it's very difficult for the Congress to master its own media projection. But the modern presidency has benefited from the expansion of electronic media, and especially, as we'll see, the modern presidency rewards individuals who are savvy with respect to the media and conveying public image. Hate President Trump, love President Trump. There's no question that President Trump is a master of public media today, and that has benefited the presidency. Now, some people think that that's damaged the presidency too, as we'll see when we look at the criticisms. So, to some degree, so we've seen that the presidency grew in size, institutional complexity. The presidency grew in terms of scope and function as the federal government expanded. And to stress the point that I made earlier, as the nation grew as a major player in global affairs to be the world's greatest superpower, of all the institutions of government, the institution that growth in national power benefited, of course, was the presidency. And to that question, we'll turn on Monday and explore how that happened and how that's part of our constitutional system today.